on my attention. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words upon now, it's made with good intentions.
Welcome to 1 of 200, the New Zealand Politics and Media podcast. We've got a, I guess, broadly geopolitics podcast coming back to current events this week. Missed last week, of course, for those of you who follow our release schedule closely. And we're back with my co-host, Ginny. How you doing, Ginny?
Good, thanks. I'm feeling great. I love working in media. Best job, best industry.
And we're joined by a very special guest, Jeremy Moses as well. How you doing, Jeremy?
Kia ora, Kyle. Yeah, going well, thank you. A lot happening in the world of academia, as I'm sure there is in the world of media. So yeah, it's been a busy few months. Feels like this whole year has just been very chaotic and
Absolutely.
taking each day and feeling like dropping balls all over the place. But yeah, not too bad at the moment, thanks.
And just for our audience, in case they haven't caught our previous episode with you, what's your area of academia?
Yeah, so I work in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Canterbury. My area of interest is in humanitarianism and the connection between humanitarianism and militarism, going back several decades. So I've always been interested in, from a critical point of view, in the idea of humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect. But over recent years, I've focused on how some of those concepts that are related to militarized humanitarianism have been present in debates about the development of new weapons technologies and autonomous weapons in particular, AI weapons. So that's been my project for the last 4 or 5 years. Yeah.
Which is really coming to the fore over the last little while, and particularly with New Zealand defence and foreign affairs policy. And we'll get into that a bit later in the podcast. But first, there's some actual good news that's come around just yesterday, I believe, with a vote at the University of Canterbury from the academic board. What happened, and how did this go down?
Yeah, so this is something that's been in the works for several months now. It goes back to when the student protests took place. I think it was in mid-May. And at that time, some discussions were held with the Vice-Chancellor about the ways in which the university might respond to their concerns. And one of the suggestions was to bring a motion to academic board related to boycott and divestment and suspension of ties with Israeli universities and corporations that are known to be complicit with the abuse of Palestinian human rights or breaches of international humanitarian law. So that it took a little while to get all of that going and to get a draft done. My colleague Mahdis Azamandi wrote the first draft of that. We had discussions amongst a few staff and with the student groups about that. Went to academic board last month, and again, really good discussion. My sense was at that time that enough people in academic board weren't necessarily convinced that that particular draft was going to pass. So we decided at that time to withdraw it and bring it back the following month in a shortened version, which we did yesterday. And again, there was a lot of challenging questions asked, and I was impressed with the attitude shown by colleagues in the academic board. Many of them expressed a fair bit of skepticism about this and were concerned about whether it would mean that we would have to pass similar motions for all other conflicts around the world. So there's quite a lot of discussion about that, and I've seen that there's quite a lot of response to that effect in online discussion as well. Others concerned about how we would identify what universities or corporations were complicit, like what the standard would be and how that would play out. But the important thing here is that what this represents, the passing of this motion, is advice from academic board. So academic board is not an executive body of the university. It's the highest level academic committee in the university. So it's a high level of advice to the Vice-Chancellor and the University Council. And in this instance, this motion was framed in relation to advising on the university's external relations with other communities and universities and states, and which is a part of the terms of reference of the board. So that's yeah, the discussion was had, the motion was put, a vote was taken, and it turned out that I think there were around a bit over 50 people present, 36 voted in favour, 11 against, and the remainder, I can't remember the number, abstained. So I was really delighted to see this outcome. I have to say that during the discussion, I didn't necessarily know and didn't necessarily feel like the majority support would be behind it. So it's actually quite interesting to see, people talk about silent majorities all the time. And I think in this instance, I've found with this, I've gone through a similar process in relation to the New Zealand Political Studies Association, where we've made a statement in relation to the situation in Gaza a couple of months back. And what I've found is that a significant majority of people are actually really concerned about what they're witnessing, and they want to find ways in which to express that concern through their organizations. So you give people the opportunity to have a voice on these things, and interestingly enough, there's a lot of support for this. Yeah, so we were delighted that this got through. I can see that it's invoked a lot of rage amongst some of the usual suspects on X, and that's to be expected. Some of it's obviously really offensively racist and defamatory, often stuff about people involved, including myself. But that's the tone these days, and you kind of just have to block it out and keep going. So yeah, this doesn't mean that the university will now cut all ties immediately. And I think there's a huge amount of complexity in actually to work through in thinking about this. Some things may be fairly easy, other things less so, but it's a step in the right direction.
What do you think? You talked about a significant majority here, and when we've seen polling around this issue, and this is probably across the West, we are seeing this majority for, at the very least, a ceasefire, but very little movement among institutions, let alone governments, to actually action anything. What do you think is, from your experience going through this process, causing that paralysis where people have these strong feelings like we need to do something, but either feel like they can't figure out what to do, or feel like they can't?
Yeah, I think in some ways you have to give credit here to the Israeli propaganda system and the way in which it does present and uphold a fear around criticism of Israel. And as that I've been subject to that, including following my last visit to this very podcast from the Israel Institute, as is the usual case, but also from the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand. They weighed in following my contributions to your podcast previously. So people I think that there is a genuine fear around attracting that kind of attention. And I think that there's enough out there in terms of making the criminalization of Palestine and all Palestinians in people's heads. There's enough of that for them to have doubt about how they feel about this. People are obviously horrified to see daily pictures of maimed, dismembered children, which is something we've all been, for those following it closely, have been subjected to for the last 10 months, pretty much nonstop. But yeah, there's still that. I think we've had so many years of a very tight narrative around this, and these very strong structures of attack and accusation of anti-Semitism for anyone who is critical of any of this stuff, that there's a real sort of internal disciplining within people at the moment, and maybe that's starting to break down, but it takes time. And yeah, clearly it hasn't reached the institutional level, but I think at the public level, certainly, even in the United States, we're seeing stronger and stronger majorities in favor of immediate ceasefire. So yeah, it's a complicated political space to be in, no doubt about it.
And institutions can just take a long time to get anything done in this sense, right?
Yeah.
Even if there is a strong demand and things put on a plate for them.
Yeah, politics takes time. I've had to remind the student groups of this as well. Like one thing you realize if you start engaging in political life is just how far your views are from those of other people, and you have to respect that. There's a point at which you can't just yell at people because they're not where you are. There might be a whole lot of reasons why they're not where you are in terms of understanding or thinking about how to respond to things. So there's a real delicacy, a real, I don't know, how would I put it? Yeah, you need to be careful about how you approach these things. You need to use tact, and you need to have an awareness and a respect for where other people are, because often it's not malicious, but it does take time to do that work. It takes time.
I think X and Twitter have kind of conditioned people to think otherwise, right? And then, most people are normal and not on Twitter. And so aren't like they're not wrapped up in that discourse. They're not perhaps as exposed to that as well as kind of some of the propaganda and bad faith argument as heavily or as consistently as people who are. But as I think, or you could arguably make the case for with what's happened at your university, is that when you have gone through that and you've had these challenging discussions with your colleagues, the majority have voted in favor of it.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And like I say, I had no idea that would be the outcome. I'd kind of assumed that it wouldn't get through, to be honest. I kind of reconciled with that. If that was to be the outcome, I can accept that we hadn't done a good enough job to convince people, or people had certain reservations about what it might mean financially or politically for the university. I understand that, and I respect that. And I said that to people in the presentation I gave yesterday. But yeah, clearly even I was underestimating the sentiment that was under the surface. So
Have you found as well, this is probably the last question I'll ask just around this particular issue, but that there is a gap between wider public sentiment, which we see as more and more, as you say, overwhelmingly in favor of an immediate ceasefire, if not further action, and institutional leadership or political leadership, which seems like, whether out of expediency or their own ideological beliefs, trends the other way.
yeah, it's strange. And I think we're going to get to the issue of the non-attendance of the New Zealand ambassador, but other ambassadors as well at the Nagasaki memorial, which is indicative, I think, of what you're talking about here. The fact that we're at this point, and on the one hand, you have the mayor of Nagasaki who's taken the stand that he has, which is to invite a Palestinian representative and not invite the Israeli ambassador. But then you have all of these states, including New Zealand and a number of others. Some you might expect that from the US, and Australia, of course, to follow along dutifully with the US lead on that. I'm kind of surprised, especially with New Zealand's history of anti-nuclear politics and the connections that have been built up between New Zealand activists and political leaders and activists and political leaders in Japan around this issue over many decades, that the decision would be taken to follow the US lead on that. Really bizarre.
I guess we should be clear that the reasons given are not that we are boycotting it in the same way as the US.
That's right.
So this story is, I guess, what we call a scoop from McCall. I'll drop a link to the Substack in the summary for this episode. But the New Zealand representatives over there in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have rather, I'm just going to say this is outright cowardice from them. They're trying to walk a very thin line between following the US example, as you said, Jeremy, and not making it sound like they are. So they've said, oh, we don't have the resource to attend. This is despite attending the Hiroshima commemoration earlier in the week. I think in Mick's piece, he says it's about a 3-hour train journey down to Nagasaki. They have people on the ground in Japan. We have attended these before, but this is in light of as you said, a decision by the mayor of Nagasaki to not invite Israel to the commemoration. He's been very diplomatic about it. He said, it's not political. This is about the fact that we think it will cause unrest, and we don't want to mar the commemoration of this atrocity by having that occur. And the US has immediately said, well, we're going to boycott this. Then, as you say, Australia has followed suit. I think Germany and Italy as well have decided not to. Canada, France, and the UK are the other countries. And then, yeah, the fact that New Zealand wasn't going to attend as well was kind of flying under the radar. I haven't seen it in mainstream outlets. I haven't seen it interrogated at all, but I'm not willing to give them the benefit of the doubt on this, essentially.
No, I think that the idea that it's too expensive for them to go is clearly a weak argument to cover for the fact that they've, for whatever reason, have decided to go along with the others in not attending. Because honestly, like, why would you want the Israel ambassador to be at this? It really weird. And it's especially even from a political perspective, Japan is an important ally of the United States, one that they're trying to build closer and closer military and political ties with, although it's already, very deep in the first place in relation to their competition with China. It just seems very odd to me that they are willing to, take this stand on behalf of Israel in that context. I can't make sense of that.
Yeah. The US also the state that enacted this atrocity.
Absolutely.
To decide not to show up is deeply offensive.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's offensive. I think it's unnecessary, but it shows just how important to the US this commitment to Israel is. Like, this is, it goes beyond, I think, almost any other relationship that they have in terms of what they're willing to sacrifice. The other countries that follow along, though, that's what gets me. The US, I can kind of understand why they would do this. The other countries feeling like they need to do it as well. It really speaks to this kind of weird, cowardly, toadying kind of behavior, which we're seeing so much of. I mean, the Australian government, in relation to what's happened in Gaza, so a prime minister who used to be involved in Palestine activism and now is just completely on board with whatever he's told to do by the US. It's really, really embarrassing and cringeworthy stuff.
Yeah, and I think what's stunned me the most is, even for the US, it's not even a commitment to Israel. It's a commitment to the perception that they'll always stand by Israel. There's nothing here. There's no
strategic thing happening here. No.
Yeah, it's absurd. It's just nasty. And as you say, when Japan is among the countries who the US sees as a bulwark or another aircraft carrier against China in great power competition, it's just bad. It's just strategically, it's stupid.
I mean, I don't know what the popular opinion is like in Japan in general, and I guess that it's quite possible that there's a disconnect between the mayor of Nagasaki and the Japanese government over this. But to me, it just doesn't matter. I mean, it's a strange hill to die on, as they say, this one.
Yeah, well, to come back to the question, why do you think there is this gap between what these Western states are doing at a leadership level, what they're doing from their ministries of foreign affairs and their prime ministers, and the assumed views of their electorates? Because, this isn't like all these countries saying, oh, we'll never boycott, divest, and sanction Israel. None of these countries are sanctioning Israel, which a lot of their electorate does want. It's such just an optics decision. Like, this would have been an opportunity to take it the other way, and they've chosen not to even slightly pander to their electorates over this.
Yeah, I think a lot of the fear that I talked about before exists amongst political leaders as much as it does amongst media, academics, and others who might have views about these things. One thing that really caught my attention a couple of weeks ago was with the death, the bombing of Marj Del Shams in Golan Heights. And so in that instance for Australia, it's not even just about towing the line or even ignoring the will of the public. But the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, actually felt the need to make a social media post in which she referred to the Golan Heights as northern Israel. This is not even Australian policy. So it's really, this is something that Donald Trump did in 2019. This is when the United States recognized the Golan Heights as being a part of Israeli territory. It was widely derided at the time for doing so. There's now a settlement area in the Golan Heights called Trump Heights. So is this sort of just to do with the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu that this happened in 2019 in the US? No one else followed suit. And yet Penny Wong felt the need to use this language of northern Israel, which is not Australian government policy even. So it's even stepping beyond what their formal policies are in relation to the situation, like going out of their way to antagonize people around this issue. I don't know. I don't have a good explanation for it. I've been quite sort of confounded by it. We've now had two statements calling for a ceasefire from, what was it, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. One several months ago and one just a few weeks ago. But it's totally out of step with everything else that they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think over time it's terrible for all of these governments, the way in which they're responding to what's happening. I think historically it's just really bad behavior, and it'll be recorded as weird and bad behavior in retrospect. Like that's how it be viewed.
They've got us all complicit in a genocide, and as recognized by the ICJ as a plausible genocide still under investigation. But then just the other week as well, that these are occupied territories, that there's an apartheid system that's now on the books. We had an episode about this a couple of weeks ago when the ICJ decision dropped. And one of the pieces of advice from the court was that states should be doing everything they can to force Israel to withdraw from those occupied territories and pay reparations. I mean, New Zealand's response has not been as groveling as the Australian one, but as you say, we've called for a ceasefire in concert with some of our other partners. I think we've even called for the ICJ ruling to be upheld, but there's no action behind that. We're not actively sanctioning. We're not calling the ambassador in. We're not expelling the ambassador. And it feels like they're trying to run the virtue signaling to their electorates around a ceasefire, because that's what the polls show people want. And they feel like they can just demand it. It's happening in the US as well. Even Biden has been saying, oh, I really want this. Harris, just in the last couple of days, has said, oh, I want a ceasefire right now. It means nothing. It's meaningless, but it's being treated by media and parts of the electorate as being meaningful. But 10 months in, with zero action to try and convince Israel to act on this, let alone enforce anything, I can't see that lasting for much longer as a viable political strategy.
That may be the case, but again, as you say, it's like, what is the next step? People have been protesting week after week in significant numbers. I would say, unprecedented to have these kinds of protests over that long period of time. People have shown such commitment to coming out each week and marching for an end to the war, marching against genocide. Yeah. What does it take to shift this? I don't know. I don't think I have a simple answer to that question. And I think what we're seeing in the US is that the language of we want a ceasefire, which is what Harris has obviously adopted as her position. I want an immediate ceasefire and a lasting ceasefire. It's not really any different to what Biden has been saying, but it seems like it's enough for enough people for them to just keep moving on with what they're doing, which is to offer those occasional rhetorical claims about wanting a ceasefire, not doing anything material to actually back that up, and yeah, just continuing ultimately what is unquestioning, unconditional support for Israel.
Yeah, we've got a system that's very good at having captured electorates, I think. Not a great situation to be in. To swing it back around to the way that New Zealand has been approaching this and its alignment with, I guess, what broadly call security partners, predominantly Five Eyes countries, and most specifically of all the United States. We've seen some more hesitancy around adopting those US lines wholesale, but we've also seen in the last couple of weeks some reporting from Phil Pennington at Radio New Zealand about a bunch of Ministry of Defense and Foreign Affairs stuff that's kind of been going under the radar. And this is something that we've been talking about on the podcast since we began producing episodes. And that's this increasing interoperability between not the New Zealand state, I guess, and New Zealand industry, and the US-led military-industrial complex. Just in the last 2 weeks, we had an article that we were increasing interoperability around what US defense spokespeople were calling kill chains or kill webs. So this is the data, the strategic data and information that is used for targeting enemies of, I assume, the United States, because New Zealand doesn't really have those. This is something which feels like it's been on the horizon for a while. Even under Labour, they were discussing these things like interoperability. We warned that by beginning to do this, by opting into some of these treaties and some of this hardware and systems, it would lock us into decades of alignment with increasingly disastrous US interests. And this seems to be accelerating now.
Yeah, definitely. It's an interesting time, and a lot of it is tied to arguments or enthusiasm about AI weapons and autonomous weapons in war. So I've been watching the New Zealand debate around this and the politics around this over a number of years, and it has changed quite a lot. When Phil Twyford was the Minister for Arms Control and Disarmament, he was very enthusiastic about making New Zealand a leading state in seeking ban/regulation of autonomous weapons. That debate has been going on now for over a decade in the Convention on Conventional Weapons in Geneva. There's been dozens of meetings held. They still don't even have a definition agreed on what autonomous weapons actually are. So it hasn't really gotten far, but Twyford was very keen for New Zealand to take a strong stand against the sort of unregulated development and deployment of these types of weapons systems. And that kind of went on the back burner when he was taken out of that role. Nanaia Mahuta was given it alongside her role as foreign minister. And now, I just recently, the group that had been set up to discuss this issue and to discuss New Zealand's policy, a working group, has been disbanded as well by the current government, by the current minister. I think I'm not sure whether it was Judith Collins' decision or someone else to disband that group. There's a lot to be said around this. I have a lot of opinions on this. I think that there's a lot to be concerned about, and there's a lot to be concerned about for us in universities in particular. One thing that we've seen over many years now is the way in which universities in Australia have been essentially overrun by military industries and by Defence Force funding in Australia. So that's been a growing trend over the last 2 decades. A former colleague of mine, Sian Troth, who worked on our project on autonomous weapons, wrote an excellent paper on that covered the extent to which the military-industrial complex had permeated Australian academia, and the statistics are very hard to argue with. And there's a very visible presence of many weapons manufacturers, contractors on Australian university campuses now. Someone told me that Boeing has an office at the University of Queensland. There are certain master's degrees offered at different universities, which are entirely about business, defense business, defense industry, like training to be a manager in the defense industry. So these are seen as things that are desirable from an Australian point of view. And we've got this, there's two things happening in New Zealand at the moment. One of them is the review of tertiary education, which Judith Collins is responsible for. The other is the question around Pillar 2 of AUKUS, which is around the new development of new military technologies. I've been telling a lot of people, and I'll say it again here, that I think that we're going to see a connection between these two things. I believe that the attempt to reform funding for New Zealand universities is probably going to end up by saying we need to attract more outside money. Where is that money going to come from? It's going to be from military and technology corporations, and a combination of military and big tech corporations. And that's exactly what's played out in Australia. That's what I would expect to see here. And then so Pillar 2, being a part of Pillar 2 of AUKUS becomes an important sort of justification for that, to say we're now part of this group, so we're going to allow more funding of these types of projects in New Zealand universities. That obviously has huge impacts on, I would say, huge impacts on academic freedom in terms of what people are willing to say about these kinds of developments. Obviously, it drives people towards the money, which is that they then have to say things that are favorable towards the development of these weapons or participate in the development of these types of weapon systems. So this is something, this is speculation on my part, but I believe that this is something to look out for in the coming years. I think it's had a very destructive effect on Australian higher education, and I hope we don't go down the same path because we're definitely not there at the moment.
I'm waiting for you to weigh in with your bit, Ginny.
Ah, sorry. I'm still thinking about how grim that sounded. Like, it's just
Well, it's not written in stone, but yeah, it's a possibility. Put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, just from like a completely, I guess, divorced, I don't work in humanitarian spaces at all. Obviously, I don't work for Lockheed Martin, thank God. But like in terms of being someone who works with a lot of large corporate companies that have, I think, supply chain relationships with some of these other defense companies, I think one thing that has always sort of concerned me, especially around this discourse around like AUKUS Pillar 2 and whatnot, is I think Judith Collins has been super, super vague on whether or not there are going to be any changes to the aerospace or space industry in New Zealand. And I think that there's been an increasing tension around the operations of the Rocket Lab base in Mahia. And there's been sort of like, I guess, rumblings down the line about whether or not things are going to change. There have been lots of complaints around people who live there about increased frequency of missile launches, for example. And I just feel like it's sort of a prime location and a prime consideration. Like if New Zealand is known to not so much, I guess, have the power to produce arms and often buys it in, but we are still committed to, as Julie Collins said, being part of that partnership for Indo-Pacific industrial resilience. And she wants to help improve defense supply chain resilience, including, like reducing barriers to US corporation. If we can't make these weapons and we can't really supply them, but we do have resources like the Rocket Lab base at Mahia to assist. I mean, we are essentially, I feel like they're part of a long chain of being I guess, complicit, right, in any US attacks that might happen in the region. And that really worries me, I suppose, from like a personal perspective. I don't know how you feel about whether or not it's possible that, this US rocket lab base could become like a weapon of sorts for the US government. But we are located incredibly conveniently on the peninsula here. And there is so much foreign activity already around the Rocket Lab base that it really, I think, concerns me.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's that's a really material example of what we could see more of in the future. And as you say, if you're launching rockets that carry satellites that are then used as part of kill chains or guidance systems or whatever, data collection and analysis services, there are questions of complicity there. But a lot of it is really, we've seen this in relation to Israel's deployment of AI related technologies, for what we know about it anyway. over the past 10 months, there's been revelations about the system called the Gospel, Habsora, and Lavender, one of which is intended to target individuals, the other which is intended to target buildings. There's not much clarity about where the data comes from that feeds those systems, although someone noted, being in a WhatsApp group chat was mentioned in one of the stories about that as being one of the things that causes someone to be identified as a target under these systems. So how do they get the WhatsApp data?
Yeah.
So this is the problem with all of the technologies, and it becomes easy to there's a plausible deniability to it to some extent. So you might say Amazon Web Services and Microsoft Cloud Services and Microsoft and Google are working on this project Nimbus, which is all about providing cloud computing services to Israel. They say, well, not necessarily for military purposes, but in Israel, they say it is for military purposes. And there are so many pieces to all of this. There are so many fragments, and it's so unclear as to which pieces are operating at any given time, what data is being drawn upon, where it's being taken from, how it's being analyzed, and how that is then processed through some machine, through some algorithmic system to produce a list of targets that they then, will willingly fire missiles off at. Yes, complicity, yes, but plausibly deniable complicity, I think, is one of the consequences of these technologies. Is it's so fragmented, so opaque as to how all of this works, that it's easy to say, well, maybe it was a part of that system, but there's no confirmation that that's the case.
Yeah.
It really feels like they're going for this divorce between the state or the people of the state and mass murder. Oops, some machines did it, right? Oh, that AI got it wrong. Unfortunately, no one can be held responsible because no one pressed that button.
Yeah, I really disagree with that. Like that is a really common criticism of these technologies, and one of the driving arguments behind the call for regulation or ban of autonomous weapons is to say, who do you then hold responsible? I think I just find that to be a ridiculous argument.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it's like, of course, the people who deployed it are responsible for it, and you can go to the whoever ordered the use of force in the first place, whether it was a political or military leader. It's not difficult to establish responsibility, regardless of what type of weapon system is being used. But yes, there is the problem that argument can be made. It just depends on how weak international law is in responding to those kinds of arguments. And yeah, as you said, with the ICJ ruling, it's a strong condemnation of Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories and of their apartheid practices there, and a call for states to do something, but they just ignore it when they want to ignore it. So that's the bigger problem for international law, is not the question of how do we assign responsibility for the use of AI weapons if they commit crimes against humanity or atrocities. The issue is, how do you stop states just ignoring it and evading it anyway?
Yeah, it's not something that we're having to deal with right now, right? It's we can see numerous atrocities, too many to count, being undertaken where someone very clearly pulled that trigger, and there's not accountability for that. Why would we think there would be accountability for AI being used? But why would that create any difference in outcomes in the current scenario?
Yeah, I think the AI really just functions as a kind of justifying machine rather than actually dictating what happens. And this seems to be what's happening in the case of Israel's use of these systems in Gaza. It's like, oh, they were producing so many targets, thousands a day, and there's this kind of assumption that, oh, because it was AI, there must be some reality to that, but the reality is that you create a machine that says that everybody in Gaza is a Hamas operative, then yeah, that, of course, that's the answer that it's going to give you. It's not going to It's not going to give you a different answer to the one you want. We've seen that with ChatGPT even. It gives you answers that you want to hear. It's a pleasing machine. Like, that's the whole idea of it. You build the machine because it delivers the answer that you want it to deliver to you. And that's a weakness of AI, is that that's what it does, that the algorithm is designed to please you, so you engage with it more, and therefore the stock of the company that produce it can go up, but it just produces garbage. And so then it's really up to the person who's asking the question of the machine. That's the person who's making the decision. And the idea that, oh, we bombed 80% of the residential buildings in Gaza because Lavender told us to, is just nonsense. Like, it should be treated as just complete nonsense. They built the machine. They wanted certain answers from the machine. They got those answers. They're the ones that are responsible for it. And that is always going to be the case with these technologies, in my view.
And I think that's very clear, right, from anyone looking at this, even somewhat objectively, that the purpose is to act as a justification, but we shouldn't take it seriously in the way that the actors would like us to. What would that mean, do you think, for a New Zealand state and industrial base that, as per the Phil Pennington piece from this week, is looking to expand the weapons making defense industrial base across the Indo-Pacific region? Because those kinds of schema are at the core of the US military industrial complex. It's to create space between the electorate, or the people who elect representatives, the representatives themselves, and the outcomes of those decisions. If we are seeking to align ourselves more directly with that, or as part of that system, how do we, I mean, the independence argument, the independent foreign policy argument is already out the window at this point, but that would surely be the final nail in the coffin.
Yeah, I mean, it would be, I think, a very sad day if we start to see those, a greater intertwining of New Zealand with the US military industrial complex. It has consequences for all parts of society. The reason why these military contractors and the tech companies and a combination of the tech companies and the military contractors have so much money is because they get so much taxpayer money from the United States government. That's why they're able to go and spend it on university research in Australia in millions of dollars and open offices on different campuses, is because they're flush with money, because there's no limit to the defense budget or the military budget in the United States. And that's the direction that the cash is flowing in. And so, you can look at it as that they need repositories overseas for their capital, and putting it into research institutes both gives them a potential outcome in terms of producing new ideas or new technologies, but it also is part of cleansing their reputation. So I think that eats away at people's ability to even be critical of it, is if you see this money flowing in and people in universities are no longer criticizing this stuff because they're dependent upon it for research funding, then the opposition to these things diminishes. So I think it's really important for us. I think we still see the durability of the anti-nuclear stance. There still is a paying of respect and homage to that in any discussion around AUKUS. Like, there's always like, but this isn't going to be anything to do with the nuclear, with the Pillar One. We're going to have to rely on a lot of that embedded sentiment amongst the New Zealand public in order to try and push it out and say, well, this is not just about nuclear, this is about other things. And these other things actually will be tied to nuclear technologies of various kinds.
That's why I'm so surprised but unsurprised that there hasn't been more media or political outcry about the decision on the Nagasaki commemoration. I mean, I get it, and I get why maybe media here in particular would not want to be tapping into that sentiment, but I don't think we've really even seen anything from opposition parties on this, where it feels like it's a bit of a home run.
Yeah, I know, I agree. I think maybe it is something that will become subject to a wider debate. Obviously, people who are still involved in disarmament and anti-nuclear activism are unhappy about it and are expressing their concerns, amongst each other and where possible in media. But as you say, that's very limited, mainly to that Mick Hall piece, I think, at this stage. So yeah, that's that's an interesting one. But it is the case still that whenever this stuff comes up, that the Prime Minister Luxon always says, rules out the nuclear elements. And I think to build a political movement against further encroachment of weapons money, tech and weapons money in this country, that's what we're going to have to start from and build out from. And I think that's possible. But I also think people don't really understand the extent to which it's gone in Australia. And I think it's a really useful case study for us to understand how bad things can get. I've got a lot of colleagues in Australian universities. I'm from Australia myself and studied at the Australian National University in Canberra. And yeah, there are a few of them who aren't touched in some way by either Department of Defense funding, army funding, or funding from military industrial players.
Or directly from the National Endowment for Democracy or something like that.
Well, there's that too. And speaking of that, that is what is going to push us in the other direction, is the fear mongering around China. That's why people will willingly go along with these ideas. That's essential to it, really. So
yeah, it's been incredibly disappointing to see media here. No, I wouldn't even say fall in line, but to start drawing that line as the leading edge of narrative building here in Aotearoa. I've lost a lot of respect for a lot of journalists who I thought were better than that. And I don't even think it's naivete at this point. I'm cynical enough about media as it is. I thought people were better than this, but they're out here doing it.
Yeah, I was amazed by that Stuff series on China Influence, the most recent one. I can't remember what it was called now.
The long game.
The long game. And some of the stories were just like completely unrelated to political interference in any conceivable way. Like the one about the assault, the 2004 assault on the Chinese national in New Zealand, and it was something to do with like his fraudulent property dealings in China. It was something that had been dealt with, like the New Zealand police had been engaged with this like from the beginning and throughout, and it was just really hard to see what the claim was.
Yeah.
Like what way did this represent an attempt to influence New Zealand politics? I was, so it really felt like hunting around for something that, I'm sure, of course, China tries to influence New Zealand's politics. I don't doubt that for a second, but it just seemed to me like this was,
you don't need to draw a bow that long to prove it, right?
Yeah, it was a really unusual way to go about it.
In terms of, and maybe you can speak to this in regards to the way that corporations operate here as well, Ginny. But one of the main things the US is looking to do with these new initiatives and the Ministry of Defense here working more closely with them, and I guess our businesses working more closely with the military-industrial complex, is they want to unlock new sources of supply of weapons while integrating other countries' defense industrial bases with its own. What does that even look like for somewhere like New Zealand, which has struggled to let go of a plateauing at best, increasingly destructive agricultural economic base? I would argue we barely have the infrastructure to be doing this in the way that they seem to be indicating at this point.
I feel like, what's the word? Australia didn't Lockheed Martin. Australia will start building missiles, I think, for Lockheed Martin next year, maybe, after getting like $5 billion in funding. So I mean, with that kind of pocket change to throw around, I think we could probably make something here if a push came to shove. But I still don't know if I see New Zealand's role in this new supply chain, and also I'm not a military expert. But I just don't
I'm
see
not
sort
modern
of
military, right?
I I just, like I've bought Lockheed Martin streetwear once. No, I'm kidding. I haven't done that. I've not done that. I just want to put it out there. But I just sort of don't really see us or New Zealand being like an outpost for missile production in the same way. I think if anything, our greatest resource is probably being able to is probably our location and not so much the fact that we'd be like a portable one-stop shop missile factory in the Pacific, but more that we would have the ability to have space and all this sort of empty space in our country for endeavors like the Rocket Lab base. I don't really see us sort of, shipping out a bunch of whatever they're called, like iron nose missiles or whatever, week to week to the USA. I think our location is really the huge draw for us and why everyone is so obsessed with us signing up to AUKUS and Five Eyes, because we have the ability to launch satellites on a particular bent. Again, I'm not a scientist, but the reason why Rocket Lab's lab base is in such high demand is because we can launch satellites a particular way into the sky and have them go around in a circle in a way that other satellites can't. And for some reason, that's very important for information delivery. So that's sort of where I think our role is in this chain of events.
I agree. I don't think it'll be like a major like industrial production place. But as you say, rocket launching is clearly something that is important here. And a part of that has to do, I would come back to the research and development side. That's where the money's going to come in, and that's where the demands are more likely to fall. There are examples of this happening already. Previously, there was a company called Rocos that was a New Zealand company, and their software was intended to coordinate the moves of teams of robotic systems. So you have multiple, you might have a quadruped like the Boston Dynamics Spot kind of dogs. You might have drones. And so Rocos was developing systems for coordinated maneuvers or coordinated movement of these different types of robotic technologies. And like many of these companies, I think initially it was not claimed to have a military application. But as they grew and their technology, this is a kind of technology that the US military is certainly seeking, is ways in which to combine the various technologies that they're investing in. This, I think, will be that, as an aside, I would say that that's probably going to be where all of this stuff falls apart. We know how hard it is to combine even really basic software platforms in a small workplace environment, or even on one computer at home. It's very hard to integrate things. And so some people within the US military want the US military to be developing and building these things all themselves on the same platform, but that's not happening. The money's going to different corporations, micro funding going here, there, and everywhere, and people are contributing different bits and pieces to these new types of systems. So a software that is intended to combine the operation of these systems is something that is quite desirable from a military point of view. So Rocos became quite well known, I think, for their work with the Boston Dynamics dogs in particular. And then they were acquired by a US company called Drone Deploy, which is obviously a much bigger entity with much closer ties to military contracting in the US. So this kind of thing is what I would think would be, New Zealand might be expected to produce more of this kind of stuff, as well as the Rocket Lab, not only as a place for launching, but in terms of building the technology, research and development. So that's how I would envisage what follows from a lot of the policy direction we're seeing at the moment.
I mean, there's no real benefit to New Zealand from this. Like, that I
Apart from
can
keeping
that I can
America
see.
happy, you mean? Like apart from it being part of our commitments under things like Five Eyes and AUKUS, for example.
Well, who's that a benefit to?
I think that the money is the benefit. So
Right.
universities buy into this stuff because there's big dollars in it. If the more external research funding is received, the less the government pays, the less the university pays out of its own coffers. So there's definitely benefit. And then if you have a few successful startups that come out of universities, then that's considered to be good.
Seems so narrow. I mean, I can understand, like, you get one or two entrepreneurs who are just like, wow, I'm flush now. You get a bunch of institutions who are like, wow, we made the best missile, we killed 1 million people, fantastic. But weighed against, being an underdeveloped military outpost, isolated in the Pacific, and now with a huge target on our backs.
Yeah, never underestimate people's ability to get excited about this kind of technology war stuff, though. Like, people love to feel like they're a part of something bigger than that, bigger than themselves. We'll show Rocket Labs is like that, the nationalistic kind of story that surrounds it. It's like,
Yeah, the myth making around
little New
death.
Zealand can contribute, and America respects this, and America wants this. That kind of narrative stuff captures people. So regardless of your assessment of the costs and benefits, people love the idea of it, and some people will make money out of it.
We're getting a gold medal in kill chains.
Yeah.
Gold medal in hypersonic flight development, probably, before we do that, which is a thing that Judith Collins has actually said that we can assist with as a country, hypersonic tech development. So
yeah. Look, even when Phil Twyford was pushing New Zealand as leading on regulation of autonomous weapons, in the cabinet paper that was released, there were two carve-outs, and one was, as long as this doesn't interfere with interoperability with our partners who are redacted from the cabinet paper.
Who could guess?
Australia, the US, who would know? And that it wouldn't interfere with commercial development. So even at the time, even at that point at which it was like, we want to be against these things, it was still like, but we want to maintain the military connections, and we want to allow companies to make money out of these technologies.
Not a great state of affairs. I want to just touch lastly, kind of more trending towards current events than the wider kind of military alignment conversation we've been having. With the shift from a Biden nomination to now this Harris-Walz nomination, and whether or not that's likely to actually have any meaningful change in terms of the US approach that we've seen over the last 300 years.
Look, I think on foreign policy, it would be highly likely to be business as usual from that administration. It didn't take long for people, and people already knew, of course, in relation to Harris, but for Walz, for people to dig out his statements on this kind of unconditional commitment to Israel's security. And Harris has been a frequent speaker at APAC events over the years. So there's no prospect of any major shift on that front. And then the other big question, of course, is how they would conceive of and conduct their relations with China. And this everything we've been talking about today is kind of structured around the need for competing with China, containing China, if they don't like to use that language, but that's, we all know that that's what's happening. So the idea that a new administration, and one that is where someone's just stepping up from vice president to president, so they're already in the administration, would dramatically change that and try and actually work productively towards a more peaceful future. It's hard to see, to be honest.
How do you grapple with this? Is one issue I have with the way that this is approached, maybe by more mainstream commentators, or just human beings who are closer towards a status quo ideology or politics, is that they support all this stuff because it's a Democratic president nominee, right? But we very often just refuse to consider the difference. Should we increase interoperability? Should we align ourselves with the US and with US military and financial and industrial interests? What happens under a Trump presidency? Because that's a secondary consideration of these same people. Is, Trump is the end of democracy, but we don't have control over what happens to the leadership of the United States, because by and large we don't vote over there.
Yeah, and I mean, it doesn't even require another Trump presidency. I think the general trajectory of domestic politics in the United States is is not good. I was in San Francisco in April for a conference, International Studies Association conference, and I was absolutely floored by the state of commerce in San Francisco. It's, you know, we've always had a massive homelessness issue there, so that's not a surprise. Although the fentanyl situation gives it a different character. It causes people, I guess, to behave in a different sorts of chaotic ways on the streets. So, but the commercial heart of San Francisco is empty, essentially empty. And I've been there many times over the last 20 years, and like I say, there's always been the issue of homelessness. It's progressively gotten worse, but there's always been shops and restaurants in around the Union Square area. You know, this is the shopping district of San Francisco. I would say, you know, well over 50% of the commercial property there is empty. Even Macy's, which is like takes up 2 central blocks of San Francisco, is shutting down later this year. I don't think it's just about Amazon and home delivery and Uber, and there's something deeper going on economically there. And yeah, that combine that with the political forces that are at play. I came away from there feeling very concerned, not only about the future for people in the United States, but for the global economy in general. And so, you know, we've seen that grow over the months since then here. I think we're seeing businesses more and more struggling to stay alive, and we're seeing an increasing radicalization of politics, if what I see online is anything to go by. Quite extreme, quite violent, a real re-emergence of this sort of rage against Muslims, which
in
drove
the UK.
Brent Tarrant. Yep. And, you know, that's being fed by various sources and is easy to tap into because of its long history. Yeah, so there's a lot to be concerned about, regardless of whether Trump wins or not in the US. That's why that's also why I wonder why these countries have become, why Australia, New Zealand, and others are choosing this moment to hitch themselves so closely to the US. It just seems like, wow, that's a massive risk you're taking there. I'm not sure that what you think is going to happen is going to happen. It might be a sensible thing to really keep your distance at this point and keep your options open, because yeah, the US is in a bad place. So I really wonder where they're going to end up, regardless of the election result later
I'd
this year.
certainly be pretty uncomfortable if I was one of the many countries that had multiple US military bases at this point. Yeah. Any additions from you, Ginny?
No, I don't think so. I mean, when I was in the States, it was incredibly bleak as well, and definitely more so than in the past years that I've visited. But I feel like I was sort of going around, like I was in the Pacific Northwest for most of my trip, and pretty much everyone that was slightly older, or even like by older I mean to our young listeners out there, like 30 plus, everyone who was sort of their age demographic was talking a lot about almost like, how would you describe it? Moving home, like away from the city, like going back to where they lived in rural America, and then just going, you know what, forget about everyone else. I'm just gonna look after my family on my plot of land, look after my parents, and then just live in that isolated way and not want to participate in political society because of, I think, how jaded they are becoming as a country. I think the constant whiplash with their, I guess, exercise of democracy, with the way that things have been panning out, and I think the constant violence that people in the US live in fear of as well, both political violence and also violence acted upon them by other people with arms, for example. I think that there was a real tiredness to a lot of people that I met who were like almost felt like they were stuck there and couldn't leave, and so then their best bet was to batten down the hatches and just kind of wait it out. So it was a weird place to be, I think, coming from New Zealand, where I feel like we're not quite as downtrodden yet about the political situation. But they were just so resigned to what was happening, and it was quite hard to watch a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, that point about deurbanization, I think, is really interesting and really seems to be moving up the gears at the moment, you know, following the big movement of people into cities over the last 30 years, and now people are like, why am I here? And interestingly here, I think, Māori are really have a really good grasp on how to make deurbanization happen for their people. And I think that that's going to be a really interesting trend to watch in terms of, if this is a part of a breakdown of neoliberalism, or that return to rural areas, return to community, return to your land, and building the connection with that and building family around that. If that's a trend that's coming as a consequence of this, then I actually quite like that idea.
Yeah, might be good. I'm always just so grateful to live in a country with Māori who have maintained these communities and frameworks and structures in the face of, neoliberal colonial imperialism. Because again and again, we've seen when shock, whatever that might look like, either economic or, environmental disasters has struck Aotearoa, marae and Māori have been there for everyone. So yeah, there's definitely some optimism there from me in that sense as well. Maybe let's wrap it there. Thanks for joining us, Jeremy.
Yeah.
That's great. Always nice to chat. Thanks for the invitation.
Where can people find you if they're looking for you online?
I prefer they didn't, to be frank. Yeah, I'm on X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it for now. I think every day about leaving that space.
Good choice if you do.
Yeah, which also makes me think that I have to leave academia to do that. So, that may be, something to follow. And yeah, apart from that, you can find me on the University of Canterbury website if you search. So if you want to contact me, no abuse, thanks. I've had enough of the harassment and abuse. So just nice things, please.
Look, if anyone from our audience is getting into that, you're banned from the audience. Number 1 of 200 for you. And thanks again to my co-host, Ginny. Where can people find you?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm on Twitter because it's one of the few places that market research firms don't actually get survey data from. And I don't want to be other places. So I'm Eggs for Dogs on Twitter and pretty much everywhere else as well, Blue Sky, things like that. Please also don't harass me. Or do, I don't know, harassment builds character for me, maybe. If you want to harass Jeremy, maybe just send it to me instead, because it'll just glide off my back and he'll be unaffected by your hatred.
Fantastic. That's the role we can play.
Yeah.
Thanks also to our audience for listening in. Share, like, subscribe, or whatever they do. I'll drop some links into the summary as well. I said I dropped that McHall piece in there from his Substack. I'll drop the Patreon on there as well if you want to help fund independent media so we can keep having these discussions. That's been us for current events this week. We'll hopefully be back next week to continue doing this. We'll catch you then.
If artifices are then I'm living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's upon now. It's paid with good intentions, and I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they quote this as a cost we ought to stay. 'Cause I live amongst the people every day in this vindictive, forgetful fucking race.